Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break. We are getting down to it here. And only a couple of weeks left. Just want to remind you all, the last assignment is due on the 4th. So it's this Sunday. Term paper is due on the 18th, which is just 2 weeks after that. So I wouldn't recommend trying to write the term paper in just 2 weeks, but if that is your choice, then at least you have 2 weeks to do it. But don't forget that it's the 18th. That's the beginning of finals week. The end of finals week is the 22nd. And that means that the 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd are the only days that the final exam will be open. And I won't accept term papers after that unless you contact me in advance and tell me that you're going to miss the deadline for some reason. It's technically a term paper. You've had many, many weeks to do it. So not usually a stickler for that kind of thing, but I must inform you that this time of year, I am also very busy. So it's difficult for me to be flexible. I simply just don't have a lot of time to give. All right. So this week we are, oops, I forgot to retitle the slide. This week we're actually talking about misinformation, disinformation, and cyber warfare. This is lesson 13, not 10. But we are going to pick up a little bit where we left off last week. There was some information at the end, which is fine because it fits in with this unit as well as with the last. So last time we were together, we were talking about big data, particularly data sovereignty. We talked about data ethics versus information ethics. And information ethics are typically your responsibility as a professional or as an individual. But data ethics are typically the responsibility of nation states and those in the data ecosystem, the brokers and corporations that generate and consume data, that store it and create a market for it, really more than anything else. So along with that concept of data ethics, since nation states are a player, there's a concept of data sovereignty. The push in many jurisdictions is that essentially data, in terms of its ownership, should reside with the person to whom it belongs as a virtual extension of individual agency. So agency is your ability to know and act within your own best interests based upon the knowledge that you have available. And current data markets in places that don't have privacy as an explicit right, we have no agency over our data. We have no ability to monetize the data that we generate, to put a stop to the generation or collection and sale of data and so on. That does not necessarily mean that it's no one's responsibility, because even if we as individuals in the United States and in other jurisdictions don't have explicit privacy as a right, the US government has on many occasions throughout the years, the existence of this country, as have other nations that don't have explicit privacy rights, repeatedly asserted that they, as the government, as the authority, the law of the land, as it were, does have rights over you and your data and so on. And so this concept of data sovereignty comes from that, where essentially the government owns systems, and those systems do processing as part of the objective of governance, and in the process of governing in that fashion, have collected data, utilize that data in order to best serve the society over which they govern. The US government is certainly no different. And in the United States, of course, we also have certain tenets that we hold sacred over our society, as all societies do. If we were to say, you know, what is essentially the essence, the quintessential qualities of Americanism, certain things like rugged individualism and entrepreneurship and all of that would certainly rise to the top. And among those is also at least an idea of personal responsibility and personal agency. So even though we have no essentially again, it's another case of cognitive dissonance. Though we have no explicit right to privacy, we still, as an American value, have an expectation to privacy that no one's going to come around and tell us specifically how to live, unless, of course, there's a law that governs that particular activity. Which is why it was, well, I guess it wasn't as shocking as it should have been, but certainly in some areas of society. The revelation in 2013 that the US government was indeed violating repeatedly and as a matter of course, the rights of US citizens, it did have an impact. There's an entire term for it even. But that said, the revelations, if you were to ask an average person on the street, what important happened in 2013 that, revealed spying programs, domestic spying programs, most individuals would have absolutely no idea. And there's been late night bits that, the man on the street type interviews that they like to do, where they've asked people, who is Edward Snowden, what happened in 2013, that kind of thing. It seems as if most people just really aren't that familiar with it. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is more or less what we're going to be talking about today, which is, number one, how did these programs go on being used so long without anyone really knowing about them? Why did it take a leak from somebody with inside access to do those kinds of things? Why, when you hear the name Edward Snowden, might it be associated in your minds with the, a traitorous act or something like that, which isn't to say that it necessarily wasn't, because there's, of course, ethical arguments for and against his actions, but there's certainly specific connotations in certain circles associated just with his name, so on and so forth. Well, the reason for that is because by 2013, what we currently experience as the worldwide misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation systems were already in full swing. So being informed and getting the right information at that point was already extremely difficult. It's one of the reasons why, even though the actions of Edward Snowden did have a major effect on the world, most people on average aren't all that familiar with it and what it meant. So before we talk about misinformation, disinformation, we're going to at least clean that up loose end, or clean up that loose end from last week. So yes, in 2013, Edward Snowden was a US government contractor. He was a previous US government employee, had joined the Army, but having various different medical maladies, was discharged and instead decided to serve his country as best he could in the intelligence community. He was gifted with computers and a fairly a breadth of knowledge about him, a worldliness about him, at least to the point where the US government found that they could make use of him elsewhere. And so he worked in the intelligence community, at which point, and it should be noted that all of this didn't necessarily come from him from a perspective of simply finding something to do with himself after leaving the Army. And every interview I've ever seen about him, and there is a film starring, what's his name? Joseph Gordon-Levitt, there it is. So there is, I don't know how accurate it is, I haven't seen it, but in every interview I've seen and in that film and every bit of information I've seen regarding the topic, it seemed as if Snowden was one of the true believers. 2013 and before that, patriot, believed in America, believed in rightness and American values that essentially collectively we as a people, regardless of our nationality or whatever, essentially wanted to move forward the best for each other in a way that was amicable and potentially peaceful. And yet the realization, the reality, I should say, that sometimes individuals or groups may have conflicting goals or maybe led astray, right? And so he wanted to serve his country in that capacity, helping to bring peace and prosperity to the world. But found after his work with the government, with the access that he had been granted, that wasn't necessarily the case, that sometimes it seems that the government was overstepping its mandate and violating individual rights in an effort to accomplish a broader strategy of safety and security for all peoples. This conflicted with his personal values, and it led to him making a decision, which was that he would leak essentially these secret government programs to which he'd become privy, flee the country, and essentially blow the whistle on the whole thing. Right? And that's precisely what he did. He actually transferred documents to a third party, a journalist for The Guardian, flew to Hong Kong, and there he stayed for a number of weeks, believing that Hong Kong, if no other place, was a place where they would appreciate the act that he had done, that there was a sentiment in Hong Kong, a tradition, if you will, of protest and standing up for freedom and rights and so on, and that they would not extradite him back to the US because he knew surely that once the government became aware of what he had done, that he would be targeted for violations of the Espionage Act and labeled a traitor, because he was well aware at the time that what he was doing was completely illegal. At the very least, violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, but probably much, much more. I'm not sure if government contractors actually have to face the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but it hardly matters when you've broken a law that big. Now, as it turns out, Hong Kong was not the place for him, because it turns out that Hong Kong was very interested in keeping the US as an ally and was more than willing to do whatever it takes to one individual fleeing the country in order to do that. And so he ended up having to flee Hong Kong, hop, skip, and a jump, and eventually had to go to a place where he was absolutely certain that if for no other reason than just to stick it to the Americans, he was not to be extradited. And that was Russia, where he remained for many years and was very recently granted Russian citizenship after literally years and years of being a political prisoner there. Well, not a political prisoner, a guest of the regime, I guess. So what were these revelations? Well, there's quite a number of them. Before we actually get to the specifics on the NSA's domestic spying program, came about as a result of that. There's essentially a problem. Before we discuss specifically what they're doing, there's essentially a problem with the very premise of what the Snowden leaks revealed, which is that while whispers in dark corners do a conspiracy theory make, not all conspiracy theories are necessarily completely false. We'll talk about conspiracy theories in this unit as well, but essentially, long had people suspected, of course, that the NSA is particularly following 9/11. When 9/11 happened, the USA Patriot Act was passed. Detractors at the time argued that it was a far overreach of government authority, that there would be absolutely nothing stopping the US government from suspending habeas corpus, sending people only suspected of a crime to jail for essentially indefinitely, not requiring any of the normal standard procedures and checks and balances of our judicial system, of being able to essentially grant broad privileges to spy on Americans at home and abroad, and so on and so forth. This was all known at the time, 2001. It wasn't until the 2013 leak, however, that we realized that the promises of no, we would never do that, this is America, so on and so forth, weren't exactly upheld. And indeed, big data was making its way to a number of different places. As big data began to accrue in private interests, the government definitely got on board on that early and often as well. Right now, the biggest consumers of big data in the United States, the telecom industry, the healthcare industry, the insurance industry, and so on, began with our data collection techniques that were approved in 2001, but didn't become really technically possible until a couple of years later with broadband access and mobile technologies and so on. But since they already had authorization and there was nothing stopping them, no further legislation to prevent them, eventually all of this kind of coalesced into the data brokerage markets that we see today. So the biggest data brokers in the United States, Axiom, Experian, Epsilon, CoreLogic, Datalogix, Intellis, PQ, Exactus, for the future. There's many, many others. It's a really big ecosystem. But notice Axiom, Experian, CoreLogic, Datalogix, and so on. These are also big companies in other rights. Experian is one of the 3 major credit reporting bureaus, Datalogix, CoreLogic, and so on, big tech bureaus, and so on. Lots of fingers and lots of pies there. So big is their data warehouses, the Axiom, which is, well, we don't exactly know which is the biggest. We assume that Axiom is the biggest or one of the biggest. Has files on pretty much every single American. Experian most certainly does, Credit Reporting Bureau. In addition to that, internationally, information they've collected from foreign users of US systems, and so on, 2.5 billion people, 11,000 data points per consumer because they are collecting this information from multiple sources. What these data brokers do is they basically buy information from third parties in order to aggregate it and correlate it across multiple different points. Now, so that means, for example, here at the university, you've got you interact with certain systems, access point, and so on. All of the information from everything you do here is most certainly being recorded. It goes not even through this university necessarily, but it all goes to UW system. UW system, what do they do with it? I'm not even going to guess, but it's probably not going to be good. But that's what they do. They buy information, aggregate it, they get it all in one place. Oracle, for example, who the student information system here, Access Point, utilizes two main technologies in its stack. One of them is Oracle on the back end for the database. The other one is Campus Solutions, which is really more of a configuration and scripting package than anything else. Oracle is definitely collecting information on everything here, most certainly. So all of that goes to private organizations, private individuals even, and also is going to the federal government, and they have used it on a number of different occasions. I'm not going to go through every single case that has been solved or deals with big data, except for one, which even that's not very consequential, but you'll see when we get there. But they have been using it the entire time. The FBI has been using it. They've been purchasing personal data from their own personal broker. They're a private firm, but they contract with the federal government called Ventel. The FBI uses the information that they get from the big data brokers in order to do their own internal correlation process with their closed source systems. So the FBI has their own records that they've been keeping, obviously, since the inception of the FBI many, many decades ago. Ventel doesn't have access to those systems. At least I hope they don't. Technically, they shouldn't, but I don't know, maybe the FBI sold it. But in any event, they have their own closed source repositories. And the problem with closed source data repositories is that they are very limited. They don't have the same scope that big data can offer. So they contract with a company that is a data brokerage warehouse, Ventel. They take that data that they've purchased, and then they are able to correlate that with their own closed sources and essentially greatly expand the capability of their own data warehouse. So they're able to determine not just your record with the FBI, but all of the other information that provides context to that closed source. Let's see. Oh, yes. And the federal government has been able to do this because while the Fourth Amendment does require that a warrant must be issued only upon probable cause, describing in particular the place to be searched and the items to be seized. That's not the case when information is provided voluntarily, and Ventel, as a data brokerage firm, is more than willing to voluntarily provide information to anyone who will pay for it. Now, this has come to bite us in the behinds on several occasions already. The biggest one, I think there's a Netflix documentary or docuseries about this. What's it called? The Great Lie, The Big Lie, something like that. But 2017, the Cambridge Analytica issue. So this came to light. There were several congressional hearings about this. All of this is a matter of record. I do recommend you look it up if you're more interested in the details on this. But essentially, Cambridge Analytica is another former data brokerage firm, which was buying information from Facebook. Now, they allege that they were buying access. Facebook alleges they were buying records. Doesn't really matter. But what they were able to do is essentially grab Facebook data and aggregate it, and that was all well and good. Cambridge Analytica had been around for years prior to this scandal in 2017. They were a fairly bog standard data brokerage firm until around 2014 or 2015, when they decided, well, since we have this data, we could do our own data analytics, and they became a data analytics firm. They figured that they could extrapolate psychological profiles from the individuals in their database, and so they did. And then essentially to the highest bidder to assert that they would be able to target advertisements or otherwise information campaigns, let's say, to manipulate the public based upon those profiles. This came about particularly in the United States because of the 2016 presidential election, which I know all of you were around for that. Maybe you weren't old enough to vote back then, but certainly were old enough to at least kind of understand what was going on. But I can't really overstate how surprising it was to have Donald Trump win. And that raises a number of questions. Every time there's an election that's kind of a surprise, it raises a number of questions because it shouldn't be a surprise. There's absolutely no reason why the winner of an election should be at all surprising by the time the election rolls around. Right? As long as we have good information sharing systems and everything is working as it should, we got plenty of people who are doing polling and crunching numbers. It ought to be known well in advance. And that wasn't the case necessarily. So 2017, Cambridge Analytica, they got a lot of heat on them because the idea was that the election was a surprise because there was an X factor somewhere in the background working in favor of Donald Trump. My personal feeling on the matter is that there were probably multiple X factors that simply flew under the radar of traditional polling techniques and all of that kind of stuff. Data analytics, even in 2017, even now, still a fairly crude sort of thing. By which I mean, of course, we're still figuring out how things work and the significance of certain things and all of that. Not that it's not a sophisticated science. Just saying, there's potential there and most of it is just unrealized. So anyway, the point is that there were probably a number of factors that led to that. But of course, Cambridge Analytica got a lot of heat and they did absolutely mishandle this data. I'm definitely not going to defend them. They definitely overstepped their initial bounds. That said, in the years since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there was a lingering question as to whether or not what they did, how much influence did it actually have? And as it turns out, psychological profiling, as we talked about before, can be an important step to mass manipulation. When you understand a population, a button to press, it becomes a lot easier. But that has been true for decades and decades, right? We were talking about Edward Bernays not that long ago. You don't really need a huge data set to understand what an effective message is for the American population. You just need to have a general idea of the American population and all that. So there have been studies on the effects of Cambridge Analytica since then. And as it turns out, these types of targeted psychological profiles, the type of advertisements that would have run, probably not the smoking gun in this case. Really, all it probably did more than anything else is, well, the biggest problem, as I mentioned, is that they mishandled the data, that they had issues with privacy, issues with security, they overstepped their mandate, grabbed a lot more information than they ought not have, sold the information to third parties in violation of contractual agreements and so on. So Cambridge Analytica, definitely not the good guys here by any stretch of the imagination, but ultimately the effect that they had probably not as serious as the fear once was. That said, for Cambridge Analytica, it didn't end up doing much because there's not a lot of legislation in this area. So the Cambridge Analytica, they did go under. The CEO did resign and so on in light of all of the heat that was on them. But really all they did is change their name and the CEO moved to a different role and that's about it. They're technically still around. Right. 2018, American companies spent $19 billion acquiring and analyzing customer data, according to the Interactive Advertising Bureau. 2018, what this essentially means is that the use of big data for advertising had been a thing the entire time. It's about the only true original monetization of data at this point. But if you recall around 2018, a major change in the internet and the way that it works, a major ramping up in targeted advertisements and so on. This would be why. Hasn't been going on that long. It just seems a lot longer, I assure you. So the whole idea that American companies are out there intending to advertise specifically just to you based upon your own personal preferences no longer really a fictional fantasy. But again, there's nothing stopping any of this data from being bought or sold by anybody, really. There's no licensing process. There's no SEC for data brokerage, at least not just yet, which is why we end up with certain problems that we talked about last time with dating apps, for example, selling your data and then being used by another individual, a third party. So the app sells the data to a data brokerage. The data brokerage puts it out for sale. Anyone can buy it. Like, for example, The Pillar, a news agency, who was able to buy information from Grindr, well, through a third party, of course, and used it to out a Catholic priest. And this is not always necessarily benevolent. I mean, using big data for advertising ultimately isn't necessarily entirely, I mean, it's certainly not malevolent. It's not entirely benign. I guess you could say it's, if anything, morally neutral. If anything, there's an argument to be made that advertisements targeted to individuals are at least less annoying than advertisements that aren't. Like, for example, if I see an advertisement for something I'm genuinely interested in, I'm still annoyed, but I'm a lot less annoyed than, for example, if I'm watching an episode of Breaking Bad and Walter White storms into the RV and says, "Jesse, hold on. Meth isn't the only thing we're cooking this evening, because today's episode is brought to you by HelloFresh." I'm not interested in that, and I don't want to hear it. So I guess an argument to be made that there may be some benefit to that. If advertisement is truly necessary, then at least it's a lesser evil. But anyway, the point is that while that is itself fairly benign, which is why most people turn a blind eye to data collection and privacy issues, the truth is that with the potential that we have here, there's definitely some potential for malfeasance, for misuse and abuse, data abuse. The question is precisely how much of that are we willing to endure, and in exchange for what exactly? So, for example, China, the People's Republic of China, for years, going back at least to 2012 and probably before that, that's when I became cognizant of it, the idea that there would be a social credit system is one that was bandied about as anti-CCP propaganda, a malicious lie to slander the Chinese Republic government. Well, it turns out it's not. They've actually officially unveiled it fairly recently. So collecting their own data, which they purchase from open markets as well, but also collect themselves. For example, through programs of free physicals, they use that information as the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, or whatever that says in Mandarin, to instead monitor their population. And now, officially, in several cities, there's a pilot program for a social credit system based on these large data sets of citizens. Maybe it'll work out for them. It doesn't sound like a system that can do anything but cause problems. But hey, I'm an American, right? So anyway, surely as an American, we don't need to worry. Let's get back to talking about Snowden. All right, so yeah, again, 2013, Snowden leak. Absolutely, we did find out that while no official social credit scores are yet in development as far as we know, that the large data sets that places like China, Iran, Russia, well, name it, I suppose, in 2022, they're not alone. We're doing it too. All of the data that China uses for its social credit system, the government has, and it has had for quite a while. So, as they say, if you give up your privacy, you give up your power. Or I shouldn't say they. Thor Benson said that. I'm sure he's not. And we deal with a lot of things using gallows humor. The memification of very serious issues is obviously not new. It's a coping mechanism more than anything else. But that's where these memes come from. right? The idea that, of course, the government is fine. Of course they're right. The FBI agent watching you on your webcam or through your toaster, blocking a text, what have you. It's apparent, right? Well, the reason that it's no longer just a joke or just a conspiracy theory is because of these leaks, in which not only did the US get caught up, but so did several allied nations, because as it turns out, the NSA is also collecting information on our allies and their capabilities. Part of the reason why the US government's intelligence agencies formulate alliances with foreign powers is partly to get a peek behind the curtain and see what they're capable of. And as it turns out, the government communications headquarters is the foreign intelligence. It's not MI6, it's not MI5. It would be Britain's version of the NSA. So if we equate MI6 with the CIA and MI5 with the FBI, the GCHQ would be their version of the NSA. It's a pure intelligence agency working entirely with data. So as part of the leaks, Snowden revealed that the Brits had a host of what are known as Smurf tools. This is not smurfing as in the cyber attack smurfing. These are different types of tools. We're talking about network and hardware level attacks. And of course, the NSA has access to these tools as well. These Smurf tools like Dreamy Smurf, having the ability to turn phones on or off remotely. Nosy Smurf, the ability to make use of the phone's microphone to listen to conversations and noise in the local area. Not exactly the plot of The Dark Knight, but pretty close to it. Tracker Smurf, I think that one's self-explanatory. And Paranoid Smurf, which means that even if you are aware of these tools, and you have, let's say you root your phone, having the ability to scan for them, detect them, and get rid of them, Paranoid Smurf makes it, even that a very difficult prospect. So even if you're aware of them, getting rid of them isn't necessarily as easy as just rooting your phone and, okay, I own my device, I can do what I want. For the US, we have several systems that came to light as a result of this, X-Keyscore among them, which in his own words, Snowden describes in this fashion. So essentially, whenever an email is sent, it has to go through several intermediaries over the internet in order for that to be delivered eventually. And of those intermediaries, of course, there's going to be remote web servers which are going to host that mail until it's delivered, and often afterwards, it'll keep a copy. If you're using the web version, then definitely it will still be there. Now, email encryption is a thing, but it's not at the receiving or sending server. That's the one that enforces that level of security. And not that it matters, the NSA has other programs for backdoors into pretty much every common cryptographic scheme in use on the internet. So every email essentially is gathered. Now, these programs, again, began after 9/11. The idea is that it was necessary in order to fight international terrorism, not even domestic terrorism, because we weren't so much concerned with that back then. It was more international terrorism that was getting the big headlines that we were really afraid of. But the problem with terrorism, even international terrorism, is that it's insidious and it's asymmetric warfare. It does not require conventional supply lines, conventional transportation, or conventional communication. Essentially, international terrorists can operate domestically, which means that in order to effectively fight them, the argument for these programs is that, of course, they have to gather data on all communications in the United States in order to weed out only that which is pertinent to fighting foreign terrorism. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all the information they're gathering is not being accumulated, because they have to crunch that data. And so every email that's sent is collected. You can tag individuals, create fingerprints of them, and then use other systems that the NSA is using in order to track a user over multiple usernames, over multiple locations, multiple devices, pretty much anywhere you go with X-Keyscore and PRISM. So PRISM is how the NSA is able to get a foothold into all of this data, because if you're using Google, then doesn't Google own that data? Yeah, they do. But PRISM is a program that the NSA developed to either convince, cajole, or coerce the big tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Apple to work with them and provide essentially a steady stream of data. This, when it first came out in 2013, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure exactly why, disproportionately affected Verizon as an internet service provider, but Verizon was hardly the only ones that were doing this. Everybody essentially was doing it. So everything that they have, Google, Facebook, Apple, Verizon, Charter, Spectrum, Time Warner, all of those big telecoms, all of their information essentially gets a direct feed into the NSA systems with PRISM. That includes search histories, downloads, emails, and so on. If you go to like account.google.com, everything it says there, location history from your phone, browser history, and so on, all of that gets aggregated. And of course, it's all going to get sent up. We did talk briefly about this before, but they also had a number of ANT tools. Just like the Smurf tools that the GCHQ is using, the NSA has their own ANT tools, which they kept a secret until this leak. And unless the leak was entirely comprehensive, there's probably more on the list we don't know about. And there's probably several more that have been developed since then. Like, for example, let's see, what's a good one here? Oh, yeah, Candygram. It's a device essentially that acts as a rogue access point for GSM cell phones. This is actually something that you can't run yourself because it would be illegal. But Google wanted to do something like this for a while as well. They wanted to set up their own towers and then transport it around on their. So Google, the Google Earth cars that or maps cars that go around all over the place and record the street view and all of that. Google had two ideas. They wanted to expand the features of that service. One, they wanted to set up basically a device that would promiscuously connect to every open and available Wi-Fi network as it drove through neighborhoods. And then it would run a scan to see what it could see. So it would collect SSIDs and, if possible, the number of devices, the type of devices, and so on. The other idea they had was to use this Candygram-like device and set up their own cell phone tower so they could do the same thing with cell phones as well. But they were sued and they stopped that project. The NSA did not. So they still have their own mobile GSM cell towers, and it does proxying. So if you connect their tower, it's connected to the nearest legitimate tower, and it forwards all of your cell phone communications directly through it. You would not even notice that it's being done, except for perhaps a minor performance issue, which it's a cell phone, so would you even notice? They also have their own bugged cables, USB devices, and Ethernet connectors, and so on. Able to monkey calendar, able to transmit a cell phone's geolocation via secret text messages, even when GPS services are off. Because if you turn GPS services off, it doesn't actually turn the component off, it just stops using it. So it's still on in the background. Of course, it has to be on in the background because if you tap the screen to turn it back on, it has to come back on. And it does almost instantaneously. It should be a clue it's still actually running. So all of these interesting things, and plenty more as well. But their big data tool that was revealed in this leak was known as Boundless Informant. What it is basically is a data warehouse of all of the metadata. So if you have multiple devices and multiple accounts, let's say that they have a data feed from Google and Facebook, and let's say, sure, why not? You have an Apple device too. So all of that information is getting sent to them, but it has to be aggregated. That's what Boundless Informant does. Uses all of that information, aggregates it, collects all that metadata. It's where all of the correlation occurs. So millions, and in some cases billions of different pieces of information about single individuals, and all of that being aggregated, not just, again, for foreign terrorism suspects, but on everybody. So that if you come into contact with somebody who's on their watch list, well, now they know you and you're on the watch list and they know everything about you. They don't have to go out and start collecting information on you. They already have it, right? So let's see. Actually, before we talk about the case, I'm going to go back a little bit here because here's a very short video of Snowden describing it himself. Snowden. Black Friday BOGO. So this is directly after the leak, obviously.
Your conduct is in terms of what they say about you, how they might try to depict you. I think the government's going to launch an investigation. I think they're going to say I committed grave crimes, violated the Espionage Act. They're going to say, I aided our enemies in making them aware of the systems. But that argument can be made against anybody who reveals information that points out mass surveillance system, because fundamentally they apply equally to ourselves as they do to our enemies. When you decided to enter this world, did you do so with the intention of weaseling your way in and becoming a mole so that you could one day undermining the disclosures, or what was your perspective and mindset about it at the time that you first sort of this whole realm? No, I joined the intelligence community when I was very young, sort of the government as a whole, shortly after the invasion of Iran. And I believed in the goodness of what we were doing. I believed in the nobility of our intentions to fully oppress people, not overseas. But over time, over the length of my career, as I watched the news and I increasingly was exposed to true information that had not been propagandized in the media, that we were actually involved in misleading the public and misleading all publics, not just the American public, in order to create a certain mindset in the global consciousness. And I was actually a victim of that. America is a fundamentally good country. We have good people with good values who want to do the right thing. But the structures of power that exist are working to their own ends to extend their capability at the expense of the freedom of all publics.
Can you talk about what you think some of the most important primary documents are and what they reveal?
The primary disclosures are the fact that the NSA doesn't limit itself. It collects all communications that transmit. There are literally no ingress or egress points anywhere in the economy space where communication or enter or exit without being monitored and collected. The Verizon document speaks highly of this because it literally lays out they're using an authority that was intended to be used to seek warrants against individuals, and they're applying it to the whole society by basically subverting corporate partnership through the telecommunications providers, and they're getting everyone's call records, and everyone's internet traffic as well. On top of that, we've got boundless informant, which is sort of a global auditing system for the NSA's intercept and collection system that lets us track how much we're collecting, where we're collecting, by which authorities and so forth. The NSA lied about the existence of this tool to Congress and to specific congressmen in response to previous inquiries about their surveillance activities. Beyond that, we've got PRISM, which is a demonstration of how the U.S. government co-opts U.S. corporate power to its own ends. Companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, they all get together with the NSA and provide the NSA direct access to the back ends of all the systems we use to communicate, to store data, to put things in the cloud, And even just to send birthdays, keep a record of your life. And they did NSA direct access that they don't need to oversee to it. I think that's a dangerous capability for anybody to have, but particularly in organizations that demonstrates crime and how to get it don't want to feel themselves from both sides. Was there a specific point in time that you can point to when you cross the line from contemplation to decision making and commitment to do this? I grew up with the understanding of the world I lived in. People how do we measure, analyze, or sort of judge by these shadow figures that certainly anyone and that travel across public lines. I think a lot of people in our generation, anybody who grew up with the internet, that was their understanding. As we've seen the internet and government's relation evolve over time, we've seen that sort of open debate, that free market ideas sort of lose its domain and be shrunk. But what is it about that set of developments that makes them sufficiently menacing or threatening to you that you are going to risk what you risk in order to fight them? I don't want to live in a world where everything that I say, everything I do, everyone I talk to, every expression of creativity or of love or friendship is recorded, and that's not something I'm willing to support. It's not something I'm willing to do. It's not something I'm willing to live under. So I think anyone who opposes that sort of world has an obligation to act in the way they can. You know, I watched and hated and tried to do my job in the most policy-driven way I could, which is to wait and allow other people, wait and allow leadership, our figures sort of correct the excesses of government when we go too far. But as I've watched, I've seen that it's not occurring. In fact, we're compounding the excesses of prior governments and making it worse and more invasive. And no one is really standing to stop it.
All right, so in his own words there. So from an ethics standpoint, the Snowden leak, as I said, there's arguments I've heard both for and against what he did, and both for and against what the NSA's monitoring program did or does. And in both of those arguments, I think that there's some validity. On the one hand, the NSA is intended to fulfill their mission, and I mean, I guess in essence, it's at the most primordial level, a government's primary duty to its citizens is safety and security. Why else would we have one? And so it seems from a moral standpoint, there's at least an argument to be made that the NSA and by extension, the government in general is just leveraging whatever tools it has at its disposal in order to solve a very difficult problem. On the other hand, the idea that, well, as Snowden just said, every thought and expression is evaluated. Obviously, that is not something anybody wants, but sometimes difficult scenarios or difficult problems require compromise. So if there is an ethical failing in this, it is not necessarily in the fact that it's being done, although, again, arguments can be made back and forth on that. Just as the argument over whether or not it was ethical to leak it, I think there's both for and against that are valid. The true ethical failing in this case is one that neither these slides nor Snowden himself nor anyone I've heard discussing the topic has identified, which is not the fact that it was being done, it's the fact that it was being done in secret, right? If these programs are necessary, if they are just, and if they are to be done ethically, then they have to be done transparently. The question is why wasn't it done transparently, or why isn't it being done transparently? Well, within the intelligence community, the answer is always, to never show your hand. If your enemies know that you're using these things or that you have these capabilities, they'll find ways around it. But it seems to me like it's an open secret among intelligence communities anyway. The answer is also perhaps that, but in part, most likely, because they knew that it would be a lot more difficult, nigh impossible, to accomplish all of this if it were being done out in the open, which we saw being called out specifically in a 2020 case, US v. Malone. This is a case where this is obviously a US court, but Somali citizens were arrested within, let's see, they were arrested internationally and then extradited to the United States. And a very long court case. It took the better part of a decade to finally get a decision on this. Partly because so much of the evidence rested on classified material from the NSA. And as it turns out, part of the evidence used against these Somali nationals was information collected by systems the NSA were using, which were leaked in Snowden. The court ruled, and this was an appeal. They had already been arrested, extradited, arraigned, convicted, and so on. They were appealing their conviction. The court decided to uphold their conviction, but made clear that the evidence used to convict them was illegal and had not been gathered nor submitted in a way that's commiserate with our judicial system in the United States. But so even though it was illegal and most likely unconstitutional, it upheld their conviction, and on top of that, basically said that this is unconstitutional, but ultimately doesn't mean anything because the program, which Snowden leaked, of course, had been ended in 2015, and the program that had replaced it had been ended also. Whether or not all of this is still happening, we don't know. We simply have no insight. But I mean, most likely these programs just got buried. They got reclassified, renamed, restaffed, and most likely are still ongoing. And who knows what other capabilities there are out there. So the two reasons why, from an ethical perspective, this is an issue, because it's being done in secret, and it's being done not only to serve specific interests, but also to circumvent institutions that we as citizens believe in or ought to anyway. We got a couple more minutes, so I guess let's talk about misinformation. So misinformation, false or incorrect information. I meant to delete that slide. All right, so the problem with misinformation is that we have we have information sharing systems that are not necessarily universally accessible and not necessarily universally equitable, but it does mean it is very easy. The transaction cost for communication is now lower than ever. And so using things like social networking or social media sites, it is difficult to say through these information sharing systems whether or not sources of information are accurate or created with the same rigor as all of the others. Like, for example, if you were to see this and you have to ask yourself, is this real? All of you are savvy enough with the internet that there's probably a whole litany of tests that you personally run when you see something that you personally find to be dubious to determine the veracity of the content. Then again, there are studies that show that if you are already predisposed to wanting to believe something, then you're simply more likely to skip a couple of steps in your analysis of whether or not something is real, right? That's what happens when somebody rage shares a quote from The Onion or the Babylon Bee or something like that. They don't check to see if it's true because they want it to be true. They want to be angry and share that shit, so they do. So the KFC donut chicken sandwich might be real, But what about the KFC gaming console with a built-in chicken warmer? Well, believe it or not, both are actually true. They're both real things. So sometimes when we see things that seem too good to be true, like a gaming console with a chicken warmer, sometimes it actually is. The rule, of course, one of the tests, the litmus test for whether or not something passes muster as being true or not, is, of course, usually if it's too good to be true, it probably isn't. But sometimes we want it to be true so much, we believe anyway. Part of the problem that we have, and the reason that we need to run this test over pretty much everything that we find online, is because we are keenly aware of the fact that there's a lot of crap out there that simply isn't true. We live with it all day, every day. This is a concept known as information pollution. It's our information systems not necessarily being turned against us, but more utilized for so many different purposes at so many different times that it is impossible to tell whether or not there is any earnestness or honesty actually present until we run our own personal evaluation on it. So sometimes information pollution comes from people intentionally lying on the internet. Yes, people would just go out on the internet and tell lies. But it also is just a result of there being so many hands at so many keyboards that the general quality of information is often dubious at best as well. So one of the things that I teach both to kids and in digital forensics class is open source investigations. So OSINT, going out on the internet and trying to connect dots and find subjects and gather evidence and that kind of thing. It used to be a lot easier. It used to be a much easier process. I lately find, as the semesters tick by, that what once were very simple, easy exercises have become increasingly difficult, simply because the quality of information that's available on the internet has degraded so much over the last decade. It's become just hard to find very simple things. Like, for example, in our forensic iconology unit, one of the things we do is an OSINT challenge, where we try to determine whether or not a social media post on Twitter was the original picture, or if it was just somebody making shit up online and posting. It used to be a 3-step process. You grab the image, reverse image search, you find the artist page, there it is, good to go. Well, when we ran it this semester, I think it took the better part of 45 minutes to an hour, right? Because we found the image, we reverse image searched, which led to the entire first page of, well, first of all, Google Lens is shit now. I hate what they did to it, but we used Google Lens. The whole first page of results had our image, or images that were clearly of the same, like, what was it, the ruins of Poseidon in Greece. So pictures of the ruins, although maybe a different artist. But even the ones that had our image, none of them bothered to attribute the actual photographer. They just used the image. So everyone's using these images, no one's giving credit. It makes answering a simple question like who took this picture very, very difficult. And then let's see, what else do we do? So yeah, even those pages that use the image, oh yes, even the pages that used the image often had absolutely nothing to do with the supermoon or the ruins of Poseidon. They were just like Greek tourism sites or random blogs from travelers and stuff. Anyway, so information quality is obviously important as well. And, you know, not to shake my fist at the sky and tie an onion to my belt, which is the style of the time, but it seems to me that as time progresses, we're really losing something in our information sharing system. It's just not what it used to be, I guess. So low quality information, false information, misleading information, all of this is a big problem. All of this is known as information pollution. Now, there's 3 different types of information pollution: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation is when there's information out there that turns out to not be true, but it's usually somebody sharing something they didn't do their own research on, or, you know, I mean, this is not a thing that's just with the internet, like the old wives' tales that people used to say, like, you know, rub a lemon on a wart and it'll go away. That's a misinformation. That's not how it works. That's usually harmful, but with no bad intent. Disinformation, the very term, has a connotation that there is an intent to harm. It is false, but it's intentionally created to cause some form of harm. Then there's malinformation. We did talk about cancel culture and public shaming a couple of weeks ago. That's malinformation, right? When it's true, but it's also harmful, kind of a thing. Of course, the easiest way to control malinformation and to avoid being canceled is to just not do the thing to begin with, I guess, but whatever. So that could be, it's something that's true. People find out about it, use it against you, kind of a thing. Not always is it something that's voluntarily done, of course. It includes things that are leaked or hate speech and so on would also be malinformation. So misinformation you see all the time. Most of the time when you see it is generally fairly harmless. Something like somebody saying that Mark Zuckerberg invented the term BFF or whatever. Or news stories, right? Those clickbait stories just draws you in, more or less harmless, but not necessarily always. Whereas disinformation, again, there's a malicious intent there. Here telling people that they can vote for Hillary on Twitter just by tweeting Clinton Kane during 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. It doesn't have a time zone. Okay. But it can be harmful. Its intent is to be harmful. And sometimes you get strange posts that tend to evolve in some form or another to eventually becoming all three. So this is something, a Facebook post that's supposed to have been by Kendall Jenner. She's holding up a Black Lives Matter. This was like 2 years ago during 2020, during the riots and whatnot. Anyway, so this was posted to Twitter. It's supposed to be Kendall's official Facebook. When it was posted as like, really, does anybody notice anything about this? So if you look in the background at her shadow, there's no shadow for the sign. She's just holding her arms up. So the idea is that Kendall was producing her own misinformation. She wanted to seem woke. And so she didn't want to get in trouble or offend anybody or have a confrontation at whatever public event this was. So she posed so that she could Photoshop the sign in later and get internet points. So misinformation. The discovery that it was Photoshopped in the minds of the people who saw it was meant to be malinformation, like she was busted, they caught her. And then, as it turns out, this is Photoshopped, but she didn't post this. The whole thing is fake. She didn't post this to her Facebook. She posed this is a picture of her, but she didn't, Photoshop in a placard of any kind or anything like that. So in the end, it turned out to be disinformation, after all. All right, we'll talk about hoaxes and conspiracy theories and such next time. Let's wrap it up for today. So, take it easy.